Welcome to ADHD Support Talk Radio. My name is Tara McGillicuddy, and I'm the host of ADHD Support Talk Radio. I'm an adult ADD and ADHD productivity coach. I'm also the founder and director of ADDclasses.com. And at ADDclasses.com, we provide virtual support and education to people affected by ADD and ADHD. We offer free webinars. We have an extensive ADD audio library with more than 175 hours of courses. And we also offer more in-depth support programs. You can learn more about ADDclasses.com by going to the website www.addclasses.com. And I'd like to thank everybody who has taken the time to write a review on iTunes for ADHD Support Talk Radio. The more reviews there are, the easier it is for people to find ADHD Support Talk Radio, which means more people will be helped by the show. So thank you so much for doing that. And if you haven't written a review yet, I encourage you to do so. With that, I would like to welcome back Lynne Edris to ADHD Support Talk Radio. In just a moment, we're going to be talking about chaos and adult ADHD. So welcome back, Lynne. I'm so glad to have you back.
Thanks for having me. Glad to be here.
But before we start talking about chaos, which I'm sure most, if not all of our listeners can relate to, can you let them know a bit about yourself and how to get in contact with you after they listen to you today?
Sure. I am a life and ADHD coach. I specialize in working with adults who struggle with things like disorganization, poor time management, weak follow-through, and having too much on their plates. So for the last decade or so, I've helped individuals from all over the world to uncover their own strengths and talents and overcome their challenges to live more fulfilling and productive lives. I'm a woman with ADD myself, so I know what it's like to struggle, but I also know what it's like to feel like you're firing on all cylinders. And that's my passion, to help my clients start firing on all cylinders in all areas of their lives so that they can have more time and more energy for the things that they love. If you'd like to learn more about me and what I do, the services and programs I offer, you can visit my website. It's www.coachingaddvantages.com. So it's coaching advantages with 2 Ds. And if you're ready to start, to address your challenges with your own private coach, feel free to schedule a complimentary phone consultation there.
Okay, great. I'm so glad to have you back. Let's get into the discussion about chaos in adult ADHD. I guess the first thing we should address is, what do you mean by chaos? I know we hear that word all the time, but what does it really mean?
It's a term I hear from many of my clients, and it definitely is something I can relate to, and it can refer to a lot of different things. Generally, I think of chaos as meaning lack of order, which can show up in our physical surroundings, clutter and disorganization in our homes, in our offices, in our cars. It can show up in our behavior. And we often feel that we have a general lack of order internally as well, those of us with ADHD, in our minds and our emotions and so on. Of course, the opposite of chaos is order, and although order is something we all need some degree of, especially those of us with ADHD, it's not easy for us for lots of reasons. I think, many of us push back against order. Order sounds like it's going to feel constraining and confining and boring. And many of us with ADHD have tried to create order. I'm using my quotey fingers, as my daughter says. Or we've tried to create order in our lives in different ways, but we're unable to sustain it for a variety of reasons, so we end up with chaos. And sometimes we create chaos for others too, even though we don't mean to. Our difficulties with organization, time management, lack of planning, and prioritizing often spills over to the people around us, our partners, our families, our coworkers, and anybody else. So we create chaos, bedlam, and stress for ourselves. We create chaos and mayhem and turmoil for the people around us, even though we don't mean to. Even though we have the best of intentions, that's what we do kind of day in and day out. And it really takes a big toll on us, ourselves, but also on our reputations as well as the people around us. Our performance suffers, at home, at work. And when we function in this state of chaos, we aren't productive consistently. We might have moments of brilliance and extreme productivity and, in our moments of hyper-focus, but it isn't consistent and it isn't sustainable. So our reputation suffers no matter how smart we are, no matter how intelligent we are, how much potential we have. When we function in this sort of realm of chaos, we aren't performing to our potential. So we come off as flaky and unreliable and scattered. And even when that isn't who we want to be, and even when that isn't who we really are deep down. And our relationships can suffer. The people we care about most may not feel like they can count on us. They may not feel like we're really present when we're with them. No matter how good our intentions, again, our chaos often bleeds into the lives of the people around us, and of course, everybody suffers. We suffer too. Living in that chaos creates stress, it creates anxiety, takes a toll on you physically and emotionally, and maybe worst of all, I think, is it takes a toll on how you feel about yourself and your abilities. So I often tell my clients, you can't reach your potential if deep down you don't really believe that you can.
Mm-hmm.
When our lives are more reactive than proactive, that's that chaos. When we're spending more time putting out fires, going, emergency to emergency and reacting all the time, life sort of has us by the tail, not the other way around. So that's the kind of chaos that I'm talking about, and I'm sure most of the people who are listening to ADHD Support Talk Radio can really relate to what it feels like to live in chaos.
Yeah, definitely. And it's interesting when you talked about order being the opposite of chaos. At first when you said the word order, I was like kind of resistant towards it. And then all of a sudden I heard the word again. I'm like, that brought a little bit of peace and relaxation hearing that word. So it's funny how like order is like something we resist, but as you talked about what chaos really is, it makes sense that order would help us, and it is the opposite of chaos.
It is, and it's hard too because we do have, many of my clients, many of us have sort of strong knee-jerk sort of visceral reactions to words like, order and structure and things like that. And although they're things we need more of, they're things that we tend to resist, almost automatically.
Yeah. I mean, it may be like when we grew up or whatever else in our life, other people used the word order and it wasn't like a positive connotation to it. I can see like the drill sergeant type teacher, get your stuff in order. But yeah, order is something that's really beneficial for us and gets rid of the chaos.
It is. We got to find our just right amount of order. That's one of the things we work on in coaching, right? We don't want so much that we push back against it, but we need just enough that it's sustainable and just enough that it really supports us.
And I think I'm sure you found this, it's different for each person. No one person,
Definitely.
No two people with ADHD are exactly alike. And like you and I probably benefit from different amounts or different types of order in our lives.
Definitely. It's different for every single person, and that's one of the things that you have to sort of excavate and figure out when we're working, with a client in coaching, is helping them find their just right, I always call it their sweet spot, of order. Their Goldilocks, not too hard, not too soft, just their right amount of order.
So, other than being born with the ADHD brain, what causes chaos?
That's a big factor, right? Lack of good systems, lack of the right kind and amount of structure. Again, lack of finding your sweet spot of structure. Most of us try to implement these elaborate, perfect systems or this super rigid structure that we can't sustain. Rather than finding systems and structure that are good enough, most of my clients don't like that phrase good enough. That has sort of negative connotation. But finding, that good enough, that right amount of structure in order to calm the chaos, if we're not doing that, our perfectionism makes us throw whatever we've set up out with the bathwater when we can't sustain it, the right way. So we have to really watch that perfectionism piece. Our struggle with time causes chaos. Poor time management, not using time efficiently and effectively, not using calendar systems well. Time blindness, having a poor sense of time, the flow of time, estimating time, all of that stuff that most of us with ADHD struggle with. And again, our perfectionistic and unrealistic expectations of what we're able to do all contribute to the chaos. But so does poor task management, not having ways to effectively track and complete the things you need to do so that you can be proactive. Poor task management feeds the chaos. So when we don't have effective habits and behaviors for dealing with our to-dos, we're primarily in a crisis or emergency management mode most of the time. So again, we're reactive rather than proactive, and this creates chaos. But our physical environments, physical clutter, too much stuff can also feed the chaos. So visually and mentally overstimulating and overwhelming environments and surroundings create a cycle of disorganization. You can't find the stuff you need because there's too much stuff, so you buy more stuff to replace the stuff you can't find. You don't put things away because we don't have simple or easy ways to put things away or places to put them that don't require so much effort, or we don't have space because we do have so much stuff, to put the things away that we have that need to be put away. We don't have systems in place, again, to capture and keep track of the things that we need to do. All of that stuff, so leads to us feeling like we need to leave everything out in plain sight. One of the things that feeds chaos in the workplace, it's true at home too, is paper. So when we don't have good systems in place for task management, we leave anything paper that represents a to-do or something that needs to be taken care of out so that we can see it, because that, whole out of sight, out of mind thing is something that we worry about if we don't have good systems in place. So again, more chaos, right? Paper chaos. Yep. Again, making it harder to find the things we need, and around we go. Difficulty saying no or setting boundaries can contribute to the chaos. Flat out having too much to do in the time we have creates chaos. There's only so much time in a day. Yes, we might not always use it really efficiently, but we still, most of my clients with ADHD, most of us with ADHD tend to have trouble saying no, or realizing that they should say no, and being able to, kind of set that strictly for themselves. And all of this is often exacerbated by poor self-care. Not getting regular and sufficient sleep, not getting regular and sufficient exercise, and not eating well, not getting protein in every meal and eating regularly, not managing stress, and not what I call feeding your soul, doing the things that are joyful or are, fun for you, or things that are nurturing for you mentally, emotionally. All of that stuff is critical to your self-care. And that's essential to keeping chaos at bay. Again, it's that reactive life that causes us so much more stress and strain and really drains us physically, mentally, and emotionally. That's what feeds the chaos. That's what causes the chaos.
Yep. It's interesting. One of the first things you brought up was perfectionism, and I want to address that a little bit more, because that's been coming up a lot in the programs I offer and coaching that I do. And that's one thing that a lot of people don't realize, that they're actually, perfectionism is contributing to this. And it just seems like, okay, if I'm a perfectionist, I'm going to do everything perfect and my life's going to be great. Where it backfires, that perfectionism gets in the way. I mean, you were talking about poor task management or not having an organization system that works for you. And I think the perfectionism really can get in the way. It's like, oh, I tried doing this one before, it didn't work. Or it didn't work 100%, so I'm not even going to bother anymore. And not that people say that out loud, or I mean that's their subconscious and what they default to. Perfectionism is such a huge one when it comes to chaos and challenges with ADHD.
It's huge, and it's honestly one of the toughest nuts to crack when you're coaching a client, because I think it comes from a lot of things. I think we tend to have high standards, but that tends to shut us down, in certain, regards. And I think for most of us as we're growing up, everybody always tells you to do your best, and, do your best is tied to perfectionism. But you don't always want to do your best for everything. Not everything deserves your best, your all-out effort, all of that. So again, kind of finding where you're functioning from that and where you want to be functioning, so you can find that middle ground. But it goes to really kind of deep thinking, belief, perspective, perception stuff that we really need to address in coaching that can be a big problem. But many, if not most of my clients don't realize that perfectionism is getting in their way.
Yeah.
Because, I remember the first time somebody called me a perfectionist, I thought to myself, I may have even said it out loud, I'm a hot mess.
Yeah.
How can I be a perfectionist? I'm incredibly disorganized, and, I'm a mess. How can I be a perfectionist? Usually those two things are much more closely tied than people realize.
Yes.
If you can't put it away the right way, if you can't, put it away perfectly, if you can't, manage your paper perfectly, if you can't follow this, super duper organizational system perfectly, you're a failure. You throw the baby out with the bathwater. You start from scratch. You kind of look for the next magic system, or whatever that's going to solve all of your problems. That perfectionism it's a huge one. It immobilizes us, it paralyzes us, It keeps us stuck. It keeps us from getting started. It keeps us from keeping up with things, sustaining things once we have gotten started. I mean, it's a really big one. It's not in the DSM, but I really think it should be because it's that pervasive.
Yes. And a lot of us don't aim for good enough or organized enough. And I mean, you were saying that you use the term good enough, and it's like, you know, whether it's good enough, organized enough. I think I heard that from Dr. Ned Hallowell. I can't remember who exactly I heard that from, but like organized enough, it's like, okay, I can find things when I need them. I'm not going crazy, so that shooting for good enough, organized enough, instead of 100% perfectionism. So this is a big one, and it's interesting. I had a client who asked a question about perfectionism, and I'm like, well, you know what, you're ahead of the game because you know you're a perfectionist, where other people haven't identified. It's still a struggle, it's still challenging, but when you realize you're a perfectionist, you can be like, okay, what's going on? I can stop. I can, you know, shoot for 80% or good enough instead of getting stuck in, I can't do it, why bother?
Right. And that's hard because, you know, part of what comes with that perfectionism is the deep down belief that that's the right way to do things.
Yep.
So you've got to address all of that before you can just tell yourself, okay, I really don't need 100%, what's 80%, or, you know, that good enough phrase. That's so hard for so many of my clients to hear. You know, that's why we talk about other things. You know, we try to substitute that phrase for others that aren't so, you know, kind of emotionally charged. What's sufficient? What's appropriate? You know, what's in alignment with what you're trying to achieve? You know, we try to identify it in different ways, but it all boils down to what's good enough. And that's really hard for a lot of my clients. I know when I was in my 20s, trying to get, a handle on myself organizationally, just trying to, just trying to address some of the things that I'd always struggled with, you know, physical organization and time management and, you know, all of task management, all of that stuff. My husband is this born organized, like uber linear engineer guy, and his level of organization and what his office looks like, for example, his closet looks like, is really different than mine. And I tried for a long time to be, you know, he's a zero inbox guy. He ends every business day with zero email in his inbox. He ends every business day with literally one piece of paper on his desk, and that's his to-do list for tomorrow. I tried for a long time to emulate that, and all I did was create insanity for myself. So my office looks very different than his. His office is, it's visible through glass doors when you enter our home. He works from home also. Everyone can see it. It's lovely. My office is in a bedroom in a corner on the second floor, you know, but I'm organized enough. I rarely lose things. I rarely misplace things. I never miss appointments. I know where my stuff is. I know, I am a pile maker by nature, but I try to make my piles limited and functional and self-contained. And, so I have like one pile on my desk of the things that need to be taken care of today, and everything else is, where it needs to be. But it's not beautiful, and it's not perfect, by most people's stretch of the imagination. But it's highly functional. And that's really, where we need to start to try to shift our thinking is, how organized do I really need to be? Does my house need to look like it belongs on HGTV, every night when I go to bed? It really doesn't. Can a neighbor come in if your mail's misdelivered and they ring your bell? Can your neighbor come in and chit-chat with you? Or are you going to leave them standing out in the rain? Can you have friends over with a few minutes notice? Are you going to be mortified if your kids or someone else in your household brings home a friend? So what's good enough? What's sufficient? What's appropriate for you? That's a really hard one, and that perfectionism definitely feeds the chaos.
I think it's looking more about function over just form, because a lot of times we want to look at how it appears, but function is a big thing. Can you find what you need? Are you able to have friends over? That's more like a function, entertaining, socializing. And a lot of times, like you brought up the example with your husband, we try to be like everyone else. And, we can find things. We're pretty good. We collaborate on stuff. We never miss appointments with each other. We're pretty organized. You told me I was organized once, and I'm like, no, I'm not. But I am. Functionally, I'm very organized with my business. Somebody else may look at my systems and have a panic attack, or their head's going to hurt from looking at it, but it works. So I think that's the big thing is when it comes to chaos is looking at how is it going to function. So yeah, and it's interesting, perfectionism. We were talking about chaos, and we really went into the perfectionism because it's a big thing. And it feeds into everything else, I think, with the task management, the time, and like you and I both gave examples of our own perfectionism and how we see it so often with clients.
Exactly. And it is a tough nut to crack, but it's a really important nut to crack because it's underneath everything else. So you can have, we can work out in coaching great systems and tools and, ways of doing things that could really support you and really change your life. But if you haven't addressed that perfectionism piece, that little voice in the back of your head is going to be telling you it's not good enough. That little voice in the back of your head is going to tell you, well, now you haven't done it right, perfectly, whatever your voice tells you, so why bother? You're not going to be able to sustain it. So it's, we've got to get to the, that's the part of coaching that people don't really talk that much about. We always think of coaching as being, practical systems, tools, behaviors, and it is. That practical piece is, it's a really important part of it. But we have to address the fundamental, ways that we look at things, the ways that we think about things, the things, kind of the way we view things. That stuff has to be addressed for us to be able to make the changes that we want to make and make them last. Because we've all had, glimpses and glimmers of incredible organization. I mean, there have been days, and I could probably count them on two hands, but where my inbox has been to zero at the end of the business day. But frankly, I don't think it's worth that much energy. I can find what I need, and that's fine, So again, it's got to be what works for you, and your systems and your tools have to be, they have to be in your sweet spot. Your just right amount of organization, your just right amount of structure, your just right, way to maintain what it is that you need and what you want your life to look like. And if you want your life to look like, an HGTV house or my husband's office or something like that, then you're probably setting yourself up, for a lot of stress. You're probably setting yourself up for a lot of disappointment. And, honestly, other than my husband's office, even in my husband's office, there are days where, he ends the day and his office looks like a hot mess. It doesn't take him more than a few minutes to, kind of put it back together. But that's true of our house too. I mean, there are days when if somebody rings the doorbell, I think to myself, oh, geez, not today of all days, but I always, I can have them in. I can have them in and with a joke about, I'm in the middle of, whatever I'm in the middle of. I've spread out everything all over, and I've made a mess or whatever. It's okay. I'm okay with it. In general, we're where we need to be. And it took me years to get myself there. Yeah.
Now, Lynn, we are actually at the end of today's show. Do you have any final thoughts that you'd like to leave people with today? And can you definitely make sure you give out your contact information before we get going?
Sure, I do. This is such a big topic. We should probably talk about perfectionism itself another time. But, pay attention to your signs of chaos. Pay attention to, what it looks like when you're finding yourself in chaos, what it feels like, your stress level, all of that stuff. And really start to look at what's behind it. Now, again, you can contact me through my website. Again, my name's Lynne Edris. My website is coachingaddvantages.com. And on my website, I think it's on the left-hand side of my homepage, I do have a free download that you can sign up for that's called 4 Simple Steps to Go from Chaos to Calm. It's real ADD-friendly, 4 simple steps that you can implement to help alleviate some of the chaos in your life. So again, feel free to contact me through my website and know that you're not alone. This is something that a lot of us with ADHD really struggle with.
Thank you so much, Lynne Edris, and thank you everyone for taking the time to listen to ADHD Support Talk Radio. If you are listening to us on iTunes or Stitcher, be sure to stop by our website at ADHDsupporttalk.com. Thanks again.
Okay, Kevin, for the grand prize of $1 million. What color is the White House?
I know this.
5 seconds.
Oh, switching to Geico could save you a bunch of money on car insurance?
Okay. Judges? That's true, Kevin. They'll allow it. Congratulations. You're a winner.
Woo! Geico, because saving 15% or more on car insurance is always a great answer.